All right. Well, let me say hi to everybody out there. I recognize everybody's names, and so I'm glad to see you guys. I wonder if I can get a quick hands up on who is on the job market this year. I think I know, but I'm not totally sure. So if you could do a clap or whatever. Okay. So several, 3 or 4. Very good. Um, I, I've put together some ideas here, and I hope, especially those who are on the job market, will continue thinking about basically trying to get every resource you can to help you get better and more prepared for the job market and for being an appealing candidate. The notes that I have here actually started from Ann Campbell a few years back. I think she did something similar for the student chapter. And so I asked her for her version, and then I've updated them and added some things and kind of put my take on it. But I think this, I certainly want to give her credit and then mention that this is at least 2 faculty members' thoughts on how the job search often goes. I hope this won't be too dry. Please, jump in at any point. I'll just kind of go through the list of items here and talk about them. And interject questions along the way. And then one thing I could do is if something good comes up, I could add it to the file here, and then I'll send this out later. And it could be a document that maybe you guys could share year to year, or maybe it could have further use beyond just today. So probably let's start with the CV. The CV is probably the very first thing that really gets the job search going. You probably, even if you're in your first year, you should be working on your CV. This is a document that really describes your kind of your entire academic life. Not all the way back to elementary school, but it definitely is something that describes what you've done, your research, and all these things, teaching and so forth. So the CV is something that you really shouldn't update it just once a year, for example. You should be updating it all the time, and that's where things start. So first off, CV stands for curriculum vitae. If you hadn't maybe seen that Latin before, I'm not totally sure. I think vitae means life, and curriculum means sort of maybe study or something like that. So it indicates basically your entire history, academic wise. And in that sense, it's not a resume. So it can be as long as necessary. For example, I think my CV is something like 13 or 14 pages. It contains sort of everything. And therefore it can get longer. It does not have to be a 1-page resume. So don't worry necessarily about putting more in your CV. Just go ahead and put in what is necessary. I could show you my CV a little bit later, but I'm sure you've seen them as well. It typically has areas like your education, relevant jobs that you've held, all your publications, sometimes things that you're working on, presentations, eventually students that you advise, conferences that you attend, all these sorts of things. So that can be as long as you need. I think it is a good idea to have other people look at your CV. CVs have a particular style. After you've seen a million of them, you kind of realize there's a certain style to them. And if your CV is somehow really different than the typical style, if the ordering is very off or something just seems out of the ordinary, it can throw the readers off, and it can make it harder for people to read your CV. So that's when getting comments and suggestions from an advisor, or hopefully more than one professor, can really come in handy. People in my position, let's say, are pretty good at just going through CVs and picking out information that they need. And you want to make sure that yours has all that information and has it in an easily accessible way. One thing that I've seen, and part of the reason I'm here today is because I'm chairing our hiring committee this year in our department. One thing that I've been noticing, which I think is pretty effective, is that lots of CVs will list their areas of research interest broken down into applications and methodology. So in our field in particular, You often have applications that you're interested in that really motivate your research, and then you have methodologies that you can use to attack those applications. And so I see on CVs a lot of times these days both applications and methodologies that people are interested in. So it could be, for example, applications might be healthcare and methodologies might be integer programming. So that can be an effective thing to have early on in your CV, so that people are aware of what you're into. And then you can do both things, that you can do applications and methodology, or at least you have familiarity with both. You can also include a short, concise abstract of your dissertation or key papers. And what I mean by this is, let's say that you're about first page of your CV, you go maybe 2/3 of the way down, and there's your dissertation, the title of your dissertation, and so forth. Sometimes people will put in a few sentences, very short, but a few sentences describing what's in the thesis. I think this is good when you're on the market. After you're done, after you have your first job and you're off the market, I would take those off. But I think it's good in this stage, because then people can read about your research in context. You can include submitted papers and their statuses. You know, if you've submitted a paper and it's undergoing a major revision, that's good. Generally speaking, the further along a paper is in that publishing process, the more effective that will be on your CV. So for example, if you're under second round revision, that's pretty good and indicative that paper is probably going to be published. On the other hand, if you just have works in progress, those usually aren't very helpful. So what do I mean by that? I've seen many CVs where students, in an effort to make their CV look longer and to make their work seem more like it has more volume, more quantity, they will list, let's say, 5 or 6 things that they're working on. So they'll say, this paper is a work in progress. Here's who I'm working with, and this is the journal that we're thinking about going to. I personally don't think that those kind of works in progress are all that helpful, because it looks like, well, I mean, I guess you guys probably know, I mean, just because a work is in progress doesn't mean that it's going to turn out any way that you think it's going to turn out. And so I think just making your CV look longer in that regard is not usually that helpful. Now, if a paper is about to come out and you're really confident that it's 95% of the way done, that's a different story. But you know, just kind of listing big groups of ideas that you have, I don't typically think that that's so helpful. Make sure to include all talks and teaching experiences. So, wherever you've presented a talk, that's a great thing to put on. You can even put on posters, poster experiences. I'll even add that in. And anything that you've done teaching. So that could even be on-campus things. If you gave a talk for the Informed Student chapter, that can be on there as well. It'll be discounted. I mean, you know, no one, the things that seem like smaller experiences will be noted as smaller experiences by the person reading your CV, but they can also be on there. In general, and I think this is something you'll hear me say a lot, please proofread your CV. I mean, some people like me, and you guys know me, how I am. When there are typos and there's little things that can be fixed in a CV, it just sort of, to me, it just sort of shows that you haven't taken the time to kind of be careful about what you're presenting. This can be, I mean, typos, misspellings. It can be poorly abbreviated journal names. It can be spacing problems where you have one section of your CV is spaced in a certain way, where you indent in a certain way, and then the next section you do it in a totally different way. So font changes, you know, if it's not all one consistent font, things like that. So please think about it as try to make this as easy as possible for the reader to actually read and understand. And I think proofreading speaks to that. And once you have your CV, and you know, presumably that includes some papers and things, then you'll go out on the job market, and that just simply means starting to apply. Now, one of the application process of locating jobs, that's a whole thing in and of itself. And I actually have a link at the bottom of the notes here to describe that, or to at least give you some places you can focus in. But essentially, once you start to apply, you'll want to then follow that up with going to conferences where people will be doing job interviews. And typically for us in our department, that's Informs. And a number of us are going there in the next few weeks, I know. So typically, you want to apply at least a couple of weeks before the conference. That's so that you can, so that the hiring committees have time to actually go through your application. If it's the night before Informs and you apply, it's not very likely that they're going to be able to see that. If there is a job that you're particularly interested in, then go ahead and email the hiring committee chair. You should be able to find an email of a professor and just say, I'd love to meet you at Informs. Here's a little bit of background. I'm really interested in this for this job for such and such a reason. Short email and just ask if you can meet them. That kind of personal touch where you reach out, that can mean a lot, and it can really help them remember you. So I think that's the idea here, is that you reach out for ones that you're really interested in. Now, compared to Anne's version of this, which was a few years ago, I added this version of these notes. I added this item: if at all possible, go to the conference in person. Now, that we wouldn't have even thought twice about that a couple of years ago. Now it's obviously a bigger issue. Conferences will be virtual or maybe some hybrid probably going forward, even if the pandemic ends. But I think the idea of going in person and meeting people is still very relevant. It gives you a chance to get in front of people in a very real way. And so I don't think that would be going away. So if possible, if you're comfortable and it makes sense, go to the conference in person. Now, once you get to Informs, make sure to practice your talk and really practice. I mean, I personally, and Ling, for example, can tell you this, I think you have to practice at least like a half dozen times, maybe even more, on your important talks. I mean, you really have to put some time into practice. So that for me is a little bit like proofreading. It's just making sure that things are polished and ready to go. What will happen once you do have a talk, a lot of schools will come to your talk unannounced. And so if they're a little bit interested in you, but they don't really want to spend necessarily the time to talk to you personally, they'll just come by your talk. You might notice some people you've never seen before, that maybe aren't even in your area. They'll be sitting in your talk and listening and taking notes or whatever. And then if they like you, they'll follow up with an in-person interview at Informs. Or if they decide that they, for whatever reason, doesn't seem like a good fit, then they will just go on to the next talk and they won't contact you. So some schools do that kind of secret or stealth way of looking at people. Other schools, on the other hand, will go ahead and reach out to you before Informs, or just as Informs is starting, and set up meetings with you in person, a coffee or maybe something a bit more formal. Probably not anything like a dinner. I mean, it's very unlikely that you would get invited to a dinner at Informs, but a coffee or just meeting in a location in the main hall would be very likely. There's also something at Informs called the Informs Job Fair, which is a bit more formal. Basically, companies and schools will actually pay Informs for a little booth or a little space where candidates who also get involved with the job fair can kind of walk around and meet. It's a bit more formal, like a career fair that maybe you've done in the past. So I guess what I'm saying is that Informs, there's multiple things going on. There's these kind of things where they just observe you. There's these more coffee type talks where you just get interviewed more informally. And then there's this job fair as well. So the job fair can be helpful if you want to do something a bit more formal. But you'll notice that some schools don't do the job fair. So not everybody is in the job fair. If you if you do get asked to be an interviewee, here's some tips. Be on time, please. I don't suspect that that's any big surprise to anybody. Be able to summarize your research topic and the results in about 2 to 3 minutes. And this is what you would call an elevator pitch, or slightly longer than an elevator pitch. Practice that. Just like your regular talk, you can practice this, and it can become more natural, and you can fix the way you say things, and you can say things better if you allow yourself to practice. So think about that 2 to 3 minute talk, little talk, as a way to as something that it can be improved and can make a big impression. Be able to elaborate on the methodology that you use. So a lot of you will be talking more about the application area as the main thing, perhaps, but make sure that you can also talk about methodologies, because some people will be interested. I guess the way I sort of think about it is, the application area is definitely very interesting, but the methodology, if you're good at methodologies, it also shows that you have this dimension where you can attack new applications, and maybe you can contribute to methodology. So it gives you it's sort of a different sort of dimension, maybe an application dimension and then a methodology dimension. So be ready to talk about that as well. You should be able to talk about the types of classes you can teach, tailored to the department that you're talking with. So if it's a business school that you're talking with, you need to be able to talk about business classes that you can teach. If it's an engineering department, it would be a different set of classes. So be aware of what you're able to teach. Also be able to talk about what you want to study next in your research stream. So, if you get hired by somebody, the next step usually is tenure. And so they want to know if you're thinking about 3 years in the future, or 5 years, or 6 years in the future. And if you can say something about what the future will look like, that is a plus. It's not good to say, I don't know, that I haven't thought about that. People want to know that you're thinking down the road, because to get there, to eventually get to somewhere like tenure, where you have a number of publications, takes a lot of planning. A lot of the seeds are planted in the PhD, and then they sort of grow over the next few years. So being able to say something about that is a good idea. If you're going to a department where funding is important, where faculty have to get outside funding, this usually happens in engineering, industrial engineering, for example, or computer science, be ready to talk about funding sources. It doesn't have to be super specific, but if for example, you've seen people in your field get funding from the National Science Foundation, or you've seen them get funding from the NIH, then you can talk about getting funding from similar sources, and you could probably even specify the particular program in those organizations that you would apply to. So maybe you've never heard of this. I'll just give you a little brief information about how this works. So something like the National Science Foundation, the NSF, it does have a big pool of money, but then that big pool of money sort of gets filtered down into much smaller pools. And those pools are typically either a long-standing program, so something that maybe relates to computer science, for example, the computer science program, although it has a different name. There's also an operations research program, or maybe some more time-specific program where it's a particular goal the National Science Foundation has in a short amount of time. So understanding that structure a little bit, and where you would target your application for funding, even knowing that little bit of information will be pretty impressive to the people that are interviewing you. So be able to think about that if you're applying to those type of schools. Business schools don't typically worry about funding, but it may come up. So it's worth thinking about even for business schools. Also make sure that you have some questions about the school. People love it. This works for personal relationships, and it works for professional relationships too. People love it when you ask them some questions about themselves. You know a little bit about them, you know what interests them. And so if you just read up on the department and understand what's going on in their department, some big issues, maybe about the university, or about the department, or about the college that they're in, any of that information you can gather and ask about is a terrific way to make conversation. You can even ask questions that you already know the answers to, but don't make it so simple that you could have gotten it with a Google search. For example, maybe before you came to Iowa City, you didn't know that Iowa City was where the University of Iowa was. Maybe you got it confused with Ames or something like that. So if there's anything simple that you can research with Google or something similar, just go ahead and take care of that. Don't ask those kind of simple questions. Just ask things that are a bit higher level. You can, if you like, send thank you notes and emails out after Informs, although it's not totally necessary. On the other hand, if you ever get invited to when you do get invited to an on-campus interview, thank you notes and emails after that are quite appropriate. But for Informs, it's not quite as formal. But if that's something that you like to do, send a thank you note just to make a connection, that's certainly appropriate, just not necessary. Now, I'm going to mention this one. This is something that really made a big difference for me. The idea of who you hang out with socially at a conference. So what I did, and I didn't even realize this was happening, my advisor basically told me to hang around him when I was at the conference. And that turned out to be great. So what would happen is people would come over to talk to him. And then he would say, oh, here's my student, so-and-so, and then I would meet people. And I've always found this to be a great way of getting younger people to get introduced to more senior people in the field, even if it's just for a moment. All you're doing is making a quick connection. So I would recommend doing that. So instead of maybe hanging out, let's say, just with Iowa students, or maybe just with students from a previous institution, what you could do is hang out with your advisor, or maybe if you've made connections with other senior colleagues, if you can get to a point where you're in these social situations where you get introduced to people that you should be introduced to, I think that's a great way to use Informs. A particularly good place to do that are the society meetings. For example, I'm a member of the Optimization Society. So I go there, I see all the people that I recognize, I get to introduce my students to those people. And there's probably one of these societies, transportation or data science section, that you could get involved with. And they usually have a meeting. People are usually in a really good mood. I guess they're going to be having food and drink. So usually they're having food and drink. They want to meet people, they want to talk. So I think those are great places to force yourself to be social so that you can meet people. That's how I would typically do Informs. Let me pause for a second. Are you guys have any questions at this moment about some of these things that we've been discussing?
I have a quick question. So you mentioned like a CV can be as long as it can be, right?
Right.
Is it okay to include things that are non-academic, like personal interest and stuff like that, or is it something you don't recommend?
Did you say such as your hobbies or something like that?
Yeah, so those are something I have seen in like a job resume, like job resumes and stuff like that. But when we go for academic, is it something okay to include, or?
Yes, I think it's okay to include, but I would do it very close to the end. So, for example, sometimes people will put things like the languages that they know, and they'll put maybe software that they know. And I've seen places where, like you're saying, people put hobbies and things they're interested in, or maybe some outside, for example, if you are involved with a charity and this is a very big part of your life, just as an example, then I think putting something like that could be very nice on the CV. It may, I think the value would be that it gives people reading it maybe a way just to know a little bit more about you. Perhaps they've given to the same charity, or they have some of the same hobbies, and maybe that you can have a little conversation. But it's very much on the margin. This is not, in my experience, this doesn't really generate a lot of value, but I think then putting it at the bottom of the CV in sort of a miscellaneous section would be appropriate, and nothing wrong with it. I just don't know that it's going to add tons of value, but you never know. You may put something just right on there that somehow makes a connection with somebody. That's a good question.
I have another question about the informal interview in Informs.
Mm-hmm.
So how long it usually lasts? Is it like 30 minutes, or it's different from a different person?
I think probably 15 minutes would be a more typical average time. Certainly not an hour. I think 30 minutes is probably a little bit long. And the reason I say that, it's from my own experience, but it's also from just kind of calculating, when people are going to hire at Informs, when current faculty are going there to hire, they're going to be talking to probably 10 or 12 people. So 10 or 12 30-minute interviews is pretty hard to get through. So I would imagine probably an average is more like 15 minutes.
Thank you. And another question is, I went through some job posts. Some of universities, they didn't indicate they will go to Informs. Is it polite to reach out them and ask whether you will go to Informs, especially for those schools I'm interested in?
Yes, I think so. Certainly appropriate. I would just try to find the chair of the committee, find the right email to send it to, and then just ask, tell them as you express, just tell them you're interested, and you'll be at Informs, and wondered if they would be there, and you could see them as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
This may be a silly question. So how do you find who is the chair for, say, job search committee in a university?
That's a good question. So I don't think that's silly at all. I think some job ads don't list the person. Maybe they'll just have an address, an email address. In that case, I think you could email that address and ask. Usually that would probably be some alias, or maybe an email alias that goes to someone, or it would be maybe going to a department assistant like we have, who's going to figure out the details of who to send it to. So I think if you can find an email address like that, then you can just send it to that. The other ones probably do have the name of the person. So I think that would be my guess, is that you're in one of those two. Either you get some email contact, in which case you go to that, or you get, this is the person that's chairing it. But you're right, it's not totally obvious who's the actual chair in many ads. So there's someone putting something in the chat. Oh, no problem, Junho. I'll see you later. Let's see. Oh yeah, so Junho wants to do a screenshot at the end. I'm up for that. We got about 30 more minutes. So. All right. Yeah.
Hi, Sam. I have a question.
Yes,
so you said that work in progress doesn't look good or doesn't help. What about working paper? Is there a difference between working paper or work in progress? Because some works that we are basically close to finish, but not see the submitted paper,
Yeah, so part of your question, I'm hearing part of your question is kind of like, what's the definition of a work in progress versus a working paper? I think technically, the word working paper, or the phrase working paper, means something that has been submitted, or excuse me, has been essentially finished, but not submitted, and the paper is being presented to people to get initial feedback. So I think, working paper to me means something like 90% done or 95% done. Works in progress are to me, that's a very vague idea. So it could be you had lunch with so-and-so and you guys had an idea, so you wrote up a couple of paragraphs. That could be a work in progress. So there is some distinction here, or a distinction that's not even clear, I think, to a lot of people. I guess what I would say, maybe to answer the spirit of your question, is if you think this paper is very close to being submitted and it really is almost done, then I think you could confidently list it on the CV. And you might even say to be submitted in November of 2021. You could give sort of a timeline that indicates it's very close. But if you, on the other hand, if you get into the thing where you're just starting to write down just ideas that you have, I think that's not very helpful. Maybe another thing to say is that maybe the person to ask for final decision on something like this would be your advisor, to just say, do you really think this should go on my CV? And they'll tell you yes or no. And I imagine you'll hear some different opinions, but my feeling is that if it's really just sort of an idea, it's not very far along, then that's not very promising and not very reasonable to put on a CV, mainly because, research just changes so much. And so trying to get value out of something that may not even come to pass, may not even come to be real, is kind of questionable on a CV, in my opinion.
Okay, and there are also some works that you may have the results and it's working, but you have not started writing.
Yeah, that would, to me, would be more like works in progress. You know, the writing process often changes the paper. Not always, but I mean, typically what I find is that you start to write the introduction, and then you start to write section 2 and section 3, and then you realize that you made some assumption that was incorrect, or maybe you realize you've set up your experiments the wrong way and you have to change something. So to me, something that could really be presented would really have, you know, the introduction is solid, the sections are solid, the conclusions are solid, the results are pretty solid. You're just finishing up some final details. That's more of what I would consider to be a working paper that could be shared with other people.
Thank you so much.
All right, so let me continue a little down the line. We're now I'd like to talk a little bit about the hiring committees, the search committees. This is what I'm chairing for our department right now. And actually, as a side note, something I didn't put on here, maybe I'll add it as a comment. I would say go ahead and attend on-campus interviews at your own institution. I don't know if this is the right place to put it, but I was just thinking, you know, you're going to see in November, you'll see about 5 or 6 candidates come to campus, or maybe virtually, but probably they're going to actually physically come. And that's a great way to get an idea of how the hiring committees behave, how people get asked questions during talks and so forth. So don't forget about that. You can watch our process to learn more. But this year, I'm the chair of the hiring committee. And this is the way that we are organizing things. And it's pretty typical in the operations research, operations management, business analytics field. So generally what we're going to do is when Informs is done, we'll come back and decide who we're going to actually invite for on-campus interviews. So we'll get back from Informs and take a couple of days, and you know, we'll go from like a list of like 30 down to, like, let's say, a list of 10. Now it is true, and this is something that's maybe a little bit sad, but it is true that applicants from big schools, from applicants that have famous advisors, applicants with a good publication record already, and ones that are focusing on certain topics, they do have an advantage for a lot of hiring committees. And by this, I just mean that hiring committees, for better or worse, they often look at big names, famous people, a number of publications, things like that. Now, if that's not you, you know, if you don't have all of these elements, I would encourage you not to stress out, because everybody has something that has a particular advantage for another school. The question is really a question of matching. I mean, it's not so much a question of, are you a good candidate? It's really a question of, are you the right candidate for a given school? This is very much a matching process. So when hiring committees are looking over, and hopefully you made a good impression at Informs, and they're looking over to get to their short list, they're going to look and see if you're a good match. And it's really a question of match. You know, I mean, not to get too far with the personal relationship analogy, but I mean, you know, if you're talking about two friends, it's not really that this person's good and this person's good, so they make a match. It's really just whether they match or not. And that's what's happening here. They're trying to find a good match with you. So don't forget that you have a lot of advantages for particular schools. And so they'll find you if you're a good match. The committee will then narrow the list. Often they'll take, let's say, those 10, and they'll seek the broader faculty input. So the last faculty to comment, maybe have some kind of voting mechanism. And then the hiring committee may also schedule a few informal Skype or phone interviews to settle on the short list of candidates. So that can be, for example, it may be the case that the hiring committee likes this person, but they have some questions about the research, or maybe they have questions about their teaching capabilities, or it can be the case that they have questions about their English language capabilities. That happens a lot with business schools, for example. And so they may then need a little more information, so they may ask you for a Skype interview. If you get called for a Skype interview or a Zoom interview, maybe I should put in Zoom here since a lot of us are using Zoom. If you get called for one of those, you're probably on this borderline thing. They're trying to decide if they're going to actually invite you. If they, if they didn't care, or if they didn't want you, they wouldn't bother with a Skype interview. But if they just wanted to invite you, they would just invite you. So if you get one of these, you're probably somewhere in that middle ground. So preparing for that interview would be a terrific idea. But once that short list is narrowed down, usually they'll get it all the way down to 3 or 5 to invite to campus for a single position. So 3 to 5, you see 3 to 5 people for one position, and that's usually what faculty have the time for. And it is possible, if you're good with Google, you can often find what schools are inviting whom by looking at Google seminar pages or looking for seminar pages from Google. So sometimes this is kept a little bit secret, but it's not too secret. So often you can find that out. So, for example, if you wanted to be hired by Iowa State and you hadn't heard from them yet, if you check their seminar page and then you see that they're starting to fill in people, then you're probably not going to get asked. But that sounds depressing, I guess. But nonetheless, it can answer a question for you, so that at least you're not too worried about that anymore. All right, so now let's say a little bit about the Skype or Zoom or phone interviews. Again, that would be before inviting to campus, meaning that you're a little bit on the bubble. It also happens sometimes instead of an Informs interview. So for example, if someone couldn't go to Informs, or if the Informs interview didn't work out for some reason, it could be used for checking English, as I mentioned, or questions about research fit. What faculty often feel is that they can gather a lot more information, or they can gather different types of information than from a CV by doing an actual interview. So if the CV and the papers and all the package somehow feels like there's a hole there, then they'll do this interview and then try to complement or supplement what they already know. Here you can practice with a friend. This is a great resource, a great time to use your classmates as resources as well. And typically you'll get questions that are similar to Informs interviews. Now this one, compared to Informs, so one of the questions was, how long do Informs interviews last? I would say about 15 minutes. I would think that these interviews would last more likely 30 minutes or so. They would be a little bit longer, since the pressure is a little bit, the time pressure is a little bit lower. So these could be a little bit longer than Informs, but not an hour. An hour is going to be too long, I think. Now, if you get past this phase, if you did well at Informs and maybe you had these Skype interviews, then you'll get an invitation to come on campus. Now, it is possible that you could do a virtual interview. Hopefully this year, most people will be doing things on campus, but even if you do a virtual interview, probably the points that I'm going to make here are all about, still going to apply. It's going to, the interview process will be roughly the same, just of course moved online. But nonetheless, I am kind of assuming that you have an on-campus interview. Once you get invited on campus, rest assured that you are qualified for the job. This is something that sometimes people worry about. I mean, getting an on-campus interview, I don't know how to say it exactly, except that you've passed all the basic requirements. I mean, you can do the job. They just want to know if you're going to be a good fit. I mean, if finally all the details are going to come together and you will be a good fit for their department. And so they want to interview you. They want to get to know you. They want to make sure that they like you, for lack of a better phrase. And then you'll be compared against those other candidates, of course. So that is basically the idea. But you can go in there with a confidence that you're ready for the job. I mean, you just have to do the final bit of impressing. You don't have to prove everything from the ground up. A lot of schools, I kind of just indicated it, a lot of schools will wonder what type of person you are, what kind of colleague you'll be. And generally here, I would say just don't be a jerk. That sounds like a simple thing, but it does often happen that we will get faculty candidates. They'll come in and something about their personality. Now, you may sort of disagree with the way this works. I can kind of see both sides of the story, but something about their personality just won't fit. Maybe they're a little bit cocky. Maybe they are a little bit rude in certain cases. Maybe somehow they feel more like they're suited for a big city versus maybe a smaller college town. So there's all sorts of little things that can happen in these interviews. And generally, I mean, I think it just comes back to being polite and trying to be respectful and adjust to the people that you're talking to, so that you come across as someone that would be nice to work with. Make sure to wear a suit or something very similar during the interview and at dinner. Basically, anytime that you meet with someone, you should be dressed up. There's lots of variability in there. I mean, going to dinner on the very first night is a bit more casual than going to dinner on the second night, where it's a full. I mean, let's say you just got in off a long flight. And someone is going to quickly take you out to dinner. That might be naturally more casual than the next night, where there's going to be more people at a fancier restaurant. But generally speaking, wear something that looks nice, and basically ask people to help you out. I wouldn't say that you have to spend a lot of money on this. I don't really know much about clothes in that sense. But I'm not saying that you have to spend something expensive or have to spend a lot of money, but just try to figure out a way to look the part of someone who is presentable and ready to be a faculty member, and that you're taking everything seriously. I'll tell you a quick story here. Along probably 5 or 6 or maybe 7 or 8 years ago, we had a candidate who didn't wear a suit. She came and she was in jeans and a t-shirt, and I don't want to say this is good or bad, but a number of us were thinking, gosh, did she not know that she needed to look a certain way, and that's appropriate in this case to sort of dress up and be ready in a suit. And it turned out that it was something totally explainable. Basically, her luggage got lost, and so she even had to go to Target just to get some basics. So a totally reasonable reason that we eventually knew about and we shared with one another. But it just goes to show you that this does get people's attention. That sometimes that the way you present yourself can be relevant. And people do notice it. So for better or worse, I'll just mention that as a fact of life, I guess. As you're getting ready to go on for the on-campus interview, read as much as you can about the school, the program, the classes, people that you're going to meet, especially ones that you'll actually meet in person or the ones that you'll eat with. Schools will typically send you a full itinerary that tells you basically where you need to be a couple of days in advance. They don't usually tell you all, like a whole week, because the itinerary comes together at the very last minute. But usually you'll get some kind of indication of a phone number to call if there's a problem, where you're going to be staying, for your hotel, where your first appointment is, who's going to take you to the next appointment, all these sorts of things. And so you can sort of plan, and you say, hey, I know I'm going to meet this person on this day, and I'm going to meet this person for dinner, and just study up, just try to understand who these people are and what the department is. I would even suggest, and I remember, I don't think I did this, but when I was like interviewing in Iowa, but now that I've gone to other campuses, let's say for just a talk, I'll even do things like read the local newspaper just to get some sense of what's going on in this area. What are the things that they care about? So there's all sorts of research you can do. And I think almost every bit of it will pay off in some form or fashion, because it'll just give you more in your brain to talk with people about. You should be prepared to discuss research opportunities where appropriate. So if you're looking at the faculty and this person seems like they could be a good fit, you can say to them when you meet them, hey, I was reading your research and I think we have some overlap here. That kind of stuff is great. People love it when you've done your research and you know about them. Now let's talk a little bit about the research talk, because this is very important. The research talk usually lasts about 1 hour, but ask if you're unsure because, for example, here we got to the point where we were scheduling like an hour and a half for research talk. So if it's not clear, make sure you know just to ask how long the research talk should be. In my opinion, not everybody agrees with this, but in my opinion, don't put multiple talks into one talk. Your talk should be one paper, one idea, one research thing, rather than, let's say, 3 20-minute talks where you just separate them. I think the argument for doing a bunch of small talks in one big talk is that you get to show your breadth, or you get to show that you have studied a lot of things. But to me, that's the wrong approach. Basically, you should do a full research seminar that goes from A to Z on one topic. And I think that's really the best strategy. Again, you may see some differences. Maybe other people have opinions on that, but that's my recommendation. You've heard me use this phrase several times now: practice, practice, practice. I really feel like you can't practice too much. The only thing I would say is you're not memorizing. Practicing does not mean memorizing in this case. Do not memorize a script. What you should do is do your talk multiple times so that it feels natural to you, so that you almost don't have to think about what the next thing you're going to say is. You ultimately want to sound confident and natural. And practicing without memorization can be a great way to do that. Related to that, make sure you practice your timing. If people start asking a bunch of questions and all of a sudden you've lost 10 minutes, you have to have some plan to speed up if necessary. For example, right now, I have about 11 minutes left. And so I'm thinking, I want to get to some other points. I'm starting to go a little bit faster. That represents kind of poor planning on my part. But if you have sort of a backup plan, then you can get through it and people will be none the wiser. Here's a recommendation that I have heard many times, and I think it's pretty true. The idea is that if you have, let's say, a 60-minute talk, then what you should do is make the first 20 minutes, quote unquote, easy so that everybody can understand what you're doing. And then you make the last 20 minutes hard, which contains all of the technicalities and the advanced research that you're doing in order to impress those in your area. And then that implies that the middle 20 minutes would be sort of medium. You're sort of building up difficulty. I'm not totally sure I agree with this approach, but I do think it's a good rule of thumb. It basically just says that you're trying to capture everybody's attention for the first 20 minutes. You give them a good first impression, and then you show that your research really does have depth, and you allow that depth to be revealed as the talk goes on. So, maybe what this speaks to more broadly is thinking about your audience. Your audience is going to have people that know nothing about your research area, and it will have some people that know everything about your research area. And that's a very broad type of audience to deal with. And so a point like this helps to address who the audience is. One thing that you may not realize, but your research talk is also used to judge your teaching. The premise is that if you can deliver a good research talk, you can stand up there and be confident, and you can use your hand gestures appropriately, and you can explain difficult topics, then you'll be a good teacher too. I think this is generally true. It's not always true, of course. You've probably seen good research talks by people that you thought weren't great teachers, but nonetheless, this is how it will happen. Actually, when I've interviewed at Iowa, they made me give a teaching talk as well. As far as I know, I was the only faculty member that was ever made to do this. I don't know why, but I had to do a research talk and a teaching talk. This is not typical. Usually you just do one research talk that is used for judging your teaching. Make sure that you reference other relevant work in the area. It's a big turnoff if you don't cite the relevant literature. If you don't cite the relevant literature, then people question whether you even know the relevant literature, and probably someone in your audience does. And as soon as they think that you don't know the literature, then your whole foundation for your expertise starts to crumble. So make sure that you cite references in the area. And related to this point, know know if people you are referencing are in the room. So it's pretty powerful if you say, let's say that you come to give a talk here and you realize you referenced one of my papers and you say, well, this is a paper by Sam and such and such. If you can, look at Sam in the audience and make that connection, that's pretty powerful. So don't try to be aware of what social connections are there. You might even try to figure out if people who you reference it are colleagues of people in the room. So it's happened to me, for example, that I will find out someone in the audience is a co-author of someone that I'm citing, and then they'll come and talk to me and say, did you know about this joint paper and so forth. So these connections happen. So if you can be aware of them, that's terrific. Practice your talk and get feedback on the talk from your advisor, and if you can, from other faculty as well before you go. Let's see. I am gonna start to speed up a little bit here, but I want to ask a quick question. Do you guys know what the two-body problem is? You guys heard of that before?
I guess it's like couple.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Oh, is it like your couple is also looking for a faculty position in this year?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, so the traditional two-body problem is where you have two people in a couple both looking for faculty positions. So the idea is that you have to find two positions for two bodies, the two-body problem. It can also be when your spouse or your significant other wants to work in the same city as the university you're applying to. So maybe they don't want to work at the university itself, but they want to work in the same physical area. That's another version of the two-body problem. You can discuss this early. Generally speaking, you're not expected to give out personal information while you're in these interviews. But if you have this two-body problem, go ahead and bring it up early and ask questions. Lots of universities will, if they really want you to come work there, they will work very hard to help you with the two-body problem. It can be even as far as going to another department and saying, could you hire the spouse or the significant other of this person so that we can hire them? This happens, so go ahead and mention that early in the interviewing process if that's concern for you. If you can, try to see the city a bit. You can talk to people casually. It's a great informal topic. What's it like living in Iowa City or in another location, wherever you're interviewing? That can be great. Where you live is going to make a big difference in your daily life. Probably that's not a big surprise for you, but if you're a city person, you don't want to end up in a small town, that's fine. Just make sure that you understand what it's like to live where you are going to work. But when it comes to things like alcohol, either the suggestion is either don't drink alcohol at all during the interview, or a maximum of one serving per occasion. So maybe you could have a glass of wine at dinner, for example. The interviewers don't really care if you have alcohol. I mean, this is not going to be, the only thing that's going to hurt you is if you do something inappropriate based on alcohol. You drink a little too much, or you say something that you didn't mean to say. But so if you're a little unsure, just don't drink it at all, but a maximum just have one serving per occasion. The interviewers don't care what you eat. If you're a vegetarian, just say you're a vegetarian and so forth. You don't have to meet any expectations when it comes to food. You can ask about all sorts of topics during your interview. You can ask about the timeline for a decision, PhD student funding, what your teaching load would be, what's the typical teaching load there. Anything that you can talk about is fine. Probably the only thing that you don't talk about in an interview are things like negotiated terms of the offer letter. So you don't jump into negotiations at that point. So you don't start at the interview, on-campus interview, you don't start talking salary. You don't talk about, can I get a special accommodation so I only have to teach one class the first year. You don't talk about things that you want to negotiate, but you leave those for when the offer letter comes. You will be expected to talk to the dean of the college. They typically just want to see if you're generally a good match. They're technically sort of the people that hire you. So you will expect to talk to the dean. They will probably ask you similar questions as informs. But if the dean is in your area, you could get more targeted questions. So it's good to know who the dean is as well. Make sure to save your receipts because you'll get reimbursed. Usually you do have to put out the money beforehand. And then send you thank you letters and emails after the on-campus interview. Probably real letters still make the best impression, but you know, you can do that as you feel comfortable as well. Let me finish with a couple of things. Let's talk about the offer letter. Hopefully you will get an offer. What typically happens is if the campus or if the hiring committee is quiet for a long time, they're probably offering the job to somebody else first. But don't lose faith, because sometimes their offer letters get denied and then they have to come down their list. So what can often happen is if you are waiting for a number of schools and then you get an offer letter from another school, then what you can do is let the other schools that you're waiting on, let them know that you have another offer letter, and that will sort of speed the whole process up. Once you get the offer letter, you can start to negotiate things. The key thing is that your time for negotiation is at that moment. So when you have the offer letter and you have not signed anything yet, that's when you get to negotiate. You do not get to negotiate after you sign the letter. So if you have something you want to ask for, go ahead and ask for it. You don't want to ask for the moon. You don't want to ask for paradise. But if there's something reasonable, then ask for it. And this is where your advisor can come in handy too. They can definitely let you know what is reasonable. And then talk to other people that have either gone through the process or going through the process. You know, Best Day, I think, who gave you a talk a little while ago, a couple of weeks ago. She's a great example of that. Now, I'll end the whole thing, and maybe we'll have time for a couple of questions. I want to give you, I want to point you to this website. This is actually a really cool resource. I hadn't seen it up until a couple of months ago myself, but it has lots of information. You can even post your own profile on there for universities to see, and I'm not aware of another resource. This even has a tracker of people that got jobs in the past and what their starting salary was and all sorts of things. So take a look at that. I think that could be a good resource. All right, let me go ahead and stop, but thanks for listening. I hope this is helpful. What kind of questions do you guys have?
Well, I have two minor questions about writing the CV, because I was working on my CV this weekend, so I have some new questions. If I have a workshop presentation, but it's not a research presentation, it was more like a teaching presentation, for example, how to use Python in an application or something like that. So should I write it in the teaching section or in the presentation section? Like, which one you think?
I think in my, the way you described it, I think I would put it under teaching.
Teaching, okay.
Yeah.
And another question about those working papers. So if we have some papers that are like 90% of the paper is already written, so based on what you said, it's probably good to write that in my CV because I have like 90% of the paper right now. But is it professional if I write like in front of the paper that I can send you the current version of the paper if you request or something like that or not?
I definitely think that's professional. I mean, so if you have like an asterisk or something, or even something in parentheses that said available, latest version available upon request, that's definitely professional. Whether there might be a better place to put it as opposed to, so the way you described it, I think was in line with the paper itself. Whether there might be a better place to put it, like maybe sometimes people will put at the bottom of their CV references available upon request. Have you seen something like that before? So you might be able to put something like references and latest versions of papers available upon request or something like that. I think anything would be professional and helpful. What's the best way? I'm not totally sure, but I would give that as a second option. You could put it at the bottom, like references and latest versions of papers available on request, or you can put it in line as you described.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Sure. I see someone that's chatted something. Okay, someone headed out, so thank you to that person. I'll tell you what, I'll go ahead and let you go. I appreciate the chance to come and talk to you. I'll send this, Sarah, how about I send this document to you? And
Junho mentioned like, if possible, we can take a screenshot, or do we have a minute for that?
oh yeah, I certainly do. I mean, Junho had mentioned it. I don't know if his idea was that he was coming back, or if maybe Sarah's going to be doing it.
Yeah, I can do that. If we want to, I'll turn our cameras on if you're comfortable and we can take a screenshot.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, I'm about to do it, so get ready. Okay. Yeah, but if you just send me the document, then I will share it with our chapter.
Okay, yeah, I'll mail it to you right away.
All right, thank you. And thank you so much for presenting today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Good luck to everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.